Sheep stealers from the north of England, riding clans in Ulster. So good afternoon from Copenhagen. The good weather's gone and it's lashing here. And I'm going to take you back to a dark place and a dark time 400 years ago. 1603 saw an extraordinary series of coincidences that changed the history of Ireland and Britain forever. And I'm about to lay this out for you. But first, by way of a foreword, I want to read you the opening sentences of a remarkable book. The book is called The Steel Bonnets, the story of the Anglo-Scottish border reivers by George MacDonald Fraser. Some of you may remember him for his successful Flashman novels. This is what he wrote. At one moment, when President Richard Nixon was taking part in his inaugural ceremony, he appeared flanked by Lyndon Johnson and Billy Graham. To anyone familiar with border history, this sends a shudder through the mind. Now, though these three were border names, Nixon and Graham, and almost certainly Johnson, were of Scotch-Irish stock. So their families are a part of the shudder of my story. I hope you enjoy it. My name is Robert Bell, and I come from a short line of Bells. Short because, as part of the common people, we Bells cannot trace our family history back more than 150 years or so. Tracing your family history is particularly difficult in Ireland because the Dublin Four Courts were bombed during the Civil War in 1922, wiping out 1,000 years of archives, including church records. My father was Bob Bell, not a learned man, but a wise one. When I was a boy, he told me that we were descended from sheep stealers from the north of England. And he seemed pleased with the idea. Well, it's possible, but the south of England would have been more accurate. But our ancestors could have been English. Someone lived beside a bell. It could have been Scots Highlanders, the Macclesfields or the Macmillans used to name. They could even have been Norman, Le Bel, the beautiful. That's my favourite. But my daddy was probably nearly right. We're descended from a warlike family in Annandale, Dumfriesshire. We just don't know. Like much of what I'm going to tell you here today, you're going to have to put up with quite a lot of guesswork and conjecture. I came across this story in the 1980s when I was researching the book of Ulster Surnames, which has just been republished by the Ulster Historical Foundation. Good value at a tenner. In a brief paper called An Observation on Settler Names in Fermanagh, in the Clocker Record in 1975, Dr. Brian Turner laid out the bones of the story I will tell you. I thought it the most fascinating insight into our shared history, and it excited me to dig further. But still, we don't know the truth of how the remnants of the infamous riding clans of the Scots-English borders came to take part in the Ulster Plantation. But as my daddy also told me, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. We in Ulster are a people steeped in a turbulent history. The Troubles focused our minds even more keenly on who we are and who were our ancestors. Were they Irish, Norman French, English, French Huguenot, Welsh, Lowland Scot, Highland Scot? Or were they perhaps members of one particularly influential immigrant group about which we know little? Those I will talk about today are most often lumped in with the Lowland Scots, but while most of them were nominally Scottish, they were in fact a distinctly homogeneous people who stemmed from a very particular region with its own unique history and culture. Today, the Armstrongs, Elliots, Grahams, and Johnsons, like the Bells, might say that their ancestors were sheep stealers from the north of England. But that phrase is a cosy woolen blanket thrown over a wild and bloody history. The ancestors in question were the riding clans of the Scots Borders. Their official and most accurate designation was the Anglo-Scottish Border Reivers, but these rustlers were known by a host of names: the Borderers, the Raiders, the Reivers, the Steel Bonnets, the riding clans. People with these surnames began to arrive in Ulster during the 17th century Plantation. Among them were Sir John Hume and his brother Alexander, who were granted 3,000 acres in Fermanagh. John bought out his brother and several others and became the greatest landowner in the county. The Humes had been wardens of the Scottish East March for generations before becoming principal undertakers in Ulster. But the vast majority of the Borderers did not come to Ulster as undertakers or landlords, but as poor tenants. So there is very little known about their migration. But their names start appearing on plantation records immediately. And by 1659, in Pender's census, they are listed as principal names throughout the plantation settlement: Armstrong, Johnson, Elliot, Irvine, Graham, Nixon, Crozier, Bell, Kerr. And nowhere in the census are they more concentrated than in County Fermanagh. All migration happens because of either push or pull. Pull was the operative factor for many of the tenant settlers who came to Plantation Ulster. The attraction of plentiful land at cheap prices, or no or low rents. For very many others, it was push to satisfaction with their conditions in Scotland or England. In the first decades of the 17th century, no other migrants felt the push so forcefully as the Borderers. For English and Lowland Scots settlers, Plantation Ulster must have seemed a dangerous place. For the Borderers, it represented a refuge compared to what they sought to escape: the pacification of their homeland by James VI of Scotland, James I of England. At the end of the 16th century, the Scots Borders had been home to a unique and distinctive social system for 300 years. Throughout that period, wars were fought between Scotland and England over and through the borders, which was ravaged and laid waste repeatedly by advancing and retreating armies, now of the English crown, now of the Scottish. Partly because of the instability this caused, and partly because of the kind of opportunities open to the inhabitants of any borderland anywhere, the Scots Borders quickly became, and then remained, lawless. In the 13th century, when the region had become the killing ground of an endemic national war, the Borderers found that a sense of patriotism was not only a luxury ill afforded, it was an impediment to survival. Under such conditions, The only social structure that could offer security was kinship. There then arose in the borders a complex network of greater or lesser families. These were not clans in the Gaelic sense, steeped in ancient culture and lineage, but families in the mafia sense, existing by intrigue and force of arms. The clans became predators, routinely raiding deep into the northern counties of England or the southern counties of Scotland, and by blackmail, extortion, kidnapping, rape, terror, and murder, coming away with cattle, sheep, and horses, with money, jewellery, and household goods, denuding the settled citizens of both countries. Incidentally, we get our word blackmail from what the borderers called blackmail, money paid up front or else. And we also get our word bereavement to describe the condition of having been bereaved by the riding clans. Another factor in the drive to become predators was the survival in the borderlands of the ancient system of gavelkind, whereby on the death of a landowner, the land was divided equally between his sons, often leaving each insufficient land to farm. On their run back to the border, they could evade pursuit in Newcastle Waste or in the folds of the Cheviot Hills. And if all else failed, they could simply cross the border beyond the jurisdiction of pursuing officers. Raiding parties would be small or large, would involve only one clan or an alliance of 2, 3, or more, and would be Scottish or English or a mixture of both. Scots or English would as easily raid their own as the other's country. In fact, raiding was not only directed out of the borders, but within it, with clans preying upon each other. To give you some idea of the scale, the Armstrongs, at their height in the 16th century, could put 3,000 fully armed men in the saddle at 48 hours' notice. A sizable force well versed in guerrilla warfare. And if the Armstrongs were to ride out with their Confederates, the Elliots, Nixons, and Croziers, nothing less than a royal army could send them home again. Let me describe these riders more closely. The steel bonnets wore a jackal plate, a sleeveless jacket of 2 or 3 layers of quilted cloth with small iron plates overlapping each other, stitched between the layers. Chains were drawn 4 or 5 times round the thighs of the horses to help to deflect spear thrusts. A scarf was wrapped round and round the neck to protect the throat. There was no leg armour, but thigh-high, thick leather riding boots were worn with spurs. They carried small shields called bucklers, and they wore light open helmets called burgonets, the steel bonnets for which they were named, peaked on top with protective cheek plates and a flared rim to protect the neck. The main weapon was the lance, or lang spear, which was 8 to 12 feet long, at 3 to 4 meters long. Then a basket-hilted broadsword and a dirk. The English preferred longbows, and the Scots preferred a small crossbow known as a latch. Scots on foot carried 16-foot pikes, 16 foot, that's 5 meter long pikes, known as jettered staves, which had a 4-foot blade, providing a long cutting edge with a spike at the bottom for piercing. When thousands of these men fought in the Dutch wars after the pacification, they were recognized as some of the best light cavalry in Europe. The Border Reivers were very accomplished fighting men. But it wasn't just brute force. In 1596, the English captured Kinmont Willie Armstrong, one of the toughest clan leaders of the Scottish West March, during a day of truce, and imprisoned him in Carlisle Castle, one of the most formidable castles in Elizabethan England. Mortally offended, Walter Scott of Buccleuch led a light force of 80 men in an extraordinary guerrilla raid, broke into the castle in the dead of night, and freed Kinmont Willie. Elizabeth was furious. James was secretly rather pleased. Scots legend lives to this day in Scotland. The raid commemorated in the song The Ballad of Kinmont Willie, which runs to 46 verses, God help us. But there's no mention that the same Walter Scott ruthlessly imposed a pacification on his old allies 7 years later. I've gone into some detail to give you a feel for what the Borderers were. Sheep Stealers doesn't quite cover it, I think. Between the national wars, the civil powers in Edinburgh and London made efforts to control their respective sides of the region. The Borders were divided into 6 marches, a west, middle, and east march on each side. Each march was nominally under the authority of a royally designated warden. Thus, the warden of the Scottish West March was empowered to cooperate with his counterpart in the English West March in the pursuit of fugitives. In practice, the intricacies of border clanship were more than any outsider could fathom, and invariably one strong clan within a march was granted the wardenship and left to get on with policing the others. Thus, the authority of national law was corrupted into the hands of clan leaders who were themselves active in raiding. Competition for the wardenship was fierce, and this fed into the already endemic propensity of the clans to feud. The problem was deeply intractable and had remained so for 300 years, until the death of Elizabeth I in March 1603. Robert Carey, who coincidentally was the warden of the English East March, left Elizabeth's bedside and rode north on a succession of post horses, covering 400 miles in 60 hours. He arrived in Edinburgh muddy and bloody. The last horse had thrown him and kicked his head, to present James with a special prearranged ring from Elizabeth and inform him of his accession to the throne of England. On hearing the news, the Borders erupted, and what would long be famous as Ill Week, the clans took advantage of the interregnum, broke loose all along the border, and raided deep into England in search of plunder. The Grahams in particular were noted as taking the greatest liberties. This was to prove the last great expression of the riding clan way of life. Meanwhile, in Ireland, in one of history's great coincidences, the 9 Years' War had just ended with the defeat of Hugh O'Neill and Gaelic Ulster and his submission to the authority of the English crown. The surrender and submission negotiations happened at Mellifont. In the middle of them, the English side learned that Elizabeth had died. They managed to keep this secret from O'Neill and the Irish side for several days, knowing that they would return to rebellion. The war had nearly bankrupted the English crown. It had cost £2 million, and there was nothing left with which to pursue a new war. In the end, the subterfuge worked, and the final submission took place, and Ireland was finally conquered, leading within a few years to the flight of the Earls, the confiscation of their lands, and the Plantation of Ulster. On the island of Britain, meanwhile, for James, the Scots Borders now represented his middle shires, through which he must needs travel between his courts. All 6 marches now fell under his single jurisdiction. It's instructive that, faced with the daunting task of uniting 2 nations, his first policy decision was for the pacification of the borders. They had been a thorn in his side throughout his reign, and having always had a special regard to the Marches and Borders, he decreed that the very heart of the country shall not be left in any uncertainty. The pacification was ruthlessly pursued. The clans replied in their time-honoured fashion, but against the powers of 2 states gathered in a single authority, it was only a matter of time. What had been a lawless people that will be Scottish when they will and English at their pleasure had nowhere to hide. It took 7 years to fully impose the rule of law on the borders, but the back of the job was broken in only 4 years. In the first year alone, almost 200 of the principal offenders, clan leaders, were dealt with. 32 Armstrongs, Beatties, Elliots, Johnsons, and others were hanged. 15 more were sent into exile, and 140 outlawed. And in that year alone, a force of 2,000 Scots left the region to fight for the Dutch in their war with Spain. In this terrible pogrom, no family suffered like the Grahams, partly because they were the most hated clan on both sides of the border, and partly because their lands in Eskdale were among the most fertile in the marches. They were singled out for the most severe treatment. A border commission was established with special instructions to deal with the malefactors of the name of Graham. Their lands were confiscated and they were hunted down, executed, and transported in their hundreds. They were tried and hanged for their activities during Ill Week, for which a general pardon had supposedly been granted, and the commission searched far back in the records for any crime that they could be arraigned for. In 1606, of the pitiful remnant of Grahams remaining in Eskdale, the commission transported 50 families to Roscommon in Ireland. Within 2 years, their plantation there had disintegrated and the Grahams had scattered. Though many returned home, enough of them caused enough problems throughout Ireland that a suggestion was made that they be rounded up and retransported to Ulster. The Irish Lord Deputy had the sense to leave them dispersed, for if they should be placed upon any land together, the next country will find them ill neighbours. Those Roscommon Grahams who sought out kinsmen in Ulster must have been solaced by the numbers of borderers they found already ensconced in the plantation counties and in Antrim and Down, and the stream of others steadily arriving. Though a number of these were English borderers, a first glance at a surnames map of the borders reveals that the majority of those who came to Ulster were from the Scottish marches, and in particular the West and the Middle March, the toughest and most turbulent of the whole frontier. Their numbers are very difficult to gauge, but they were large. During the 1641 Rising, for instance, there were 260 Johnsons alone enlisted under Sir William Cole in Enniskillen. Fermanagh had been filling with borderers for 30 years. Their names appear everywhere in Ulster records of the first half of the 17th century. But why were they concentrated in Fermanagh? Well, the great border lords, the Humes, had been granted land there, but the Humes were royal favourites and had implemented the pacification in the East March, so were not obviously friendly. Fermanagh was previously known as Maguire's County, and Maguire had been O'Neill's right hand, so maybe the garrison needed to be tougher there. But perhaps it was that Fermanagh, being on the border of the plantation, suited the mentality of the borders. And then it was the remotest of the settlements, as far as they could get from their homeland and from Edinburgh and London, useful when you were on the run. The influence that they had there and elsewhere in Ulster can only be surmised, but two stories suggest that it was great. Firstly, where the plantation settlement in the other 6 planted counties was destroyed in the 1641 Rising, at its end, Scots border names still predominated in Fermanagh. Either holed up in Enniskillen throughout the Rising, or by going to the Fern, as their ancestors had done for generations, they survived. To a young, undermanned garrison of civil lowland peasants and English labourers, the borderers brought in their blood, the skills of low-intensity warfare, of the construction and use of weapons, and the design of fortified houses, the bonds that the undertakers were required to erect. The second fact provides the twist in the tale and goes some way towards explaining the religious history of Fermanagh as well. For the Scots borderers were Catholics. The Reformation had been unable to penetrate so lawless a region. In fact, the rescue of Kinmont Willie from Carlisle had Elizabeth ranting about a popish plot. But to be more accurate, the borderers were only nominally Catholic. In practice, they were godless. It was said of them, if Jesus Christ were amongst them, they would deceive him. A 16th century traveller in what was known as the cockpit of the borders, on finding no churches, asked a borderer, "Are there no Christians in Liddesdale?" To which he was answered, "Nah, we's all Elliots and Armstrongs here." For the borderers, religion can have played no part in their contribution to the early events of the Ulster conflict. In fact, in some parts of Fermanagh, settled by borderers, no Protestant churches at all were built for almost 100 years. So here we have the borderers, godless, nominally Catholic, in a political environment where neither relationship with the Almighty could be tenable forever. Over the century, it would have become a political necessity for them to become Protestant. And being a political decision unfettered by articles of faith, the church wherein all power lay was the obvious place to worship. This goes some way towards explaining why Protestant Fermanagh became and remains solidly Church of Ireland, the only one of the northern countries where Protestantism is not dominated by Presbyterians. Here's a wee aside. The Forsters were traditionally wardens of the English Middlemarch and were described as venal as any of the families on the Scottish side. Now, Forster and Foster were synonyms. It's the same name. Arlene Foster is not a Foster by birth. She's a Kelly. How that happened, God knows. Nonetheless, it's interesting that though she was leader of the DUP, sorry, hold on a second. It's interesting that though she was leader of the DUP, she is not a Free Presbyterian, not even a Presbyterian at all. The Fosters from Fermanagh are Church of Ireland. A further aside, one of the lesser families of the English Middlemarch under the Fosters were the Dodses. To get back to the story, the tenacity of the Borders and their sons in riding out the 1641 rising and beyond in Fermanagh is borne out by the surname statistics of the plantation counties in the present day. In Cavan, Donegal, and Tyrone, all the top 5 most numerous names are Irish. In Armagh and Derry, there is at most only one planter name in the first 5. In Fermanagh, by sharp contrast, 3 of the most numerous county names stem from the Scottish West or the Scottish Middle Marches of the Scots Borders. In order, the 5 most numerous names in Fermanagh are Maguire, Johnston, Armstrong, McManus, and Elliot. Why did the memory of this people disappear from the Ulster folk consciousness? In the case of many of them, the names were not particular to the Borders and were soon mingled with namesakes from Galloway or Yorkshire, or indeed with those Irish families who adopted their names by Anglicisation. Some of the Laverys became Armstrongs, for instance. The Borderers were a pragmatic people, and unlike the Gaels, Normans, and Huguenots, were not noted for their literacy nor interest in lineage. They may have thought that the bad reputation which preceded them was best forgotten. Their history as godless, or worse still, Catholic, may have been one that they thought was better suppressed. Perhaps the memory of the 7 years of ruthless pacification of the Borders was one which was only to be hailed by a communal forgetting of the past and a hard-headed digging in as farmers, husbandmen, and Protestants in a new land with a new body politic. Poachers turned gamekeepers, they were no longer outlaws and had become key foot soldiers in a British garrison. While the pacification destroyed the clan system and the entire social and economic infrastructure of the Scots Borders, it did not rid the Borders of the names. Today, the most common name in Carlisle is not Smith, it's Graham. The writing clans themselves are remembered, especially in Scotland, thanks to the border novels of Sir Walter Scott. He himself was a descendant of the Scots, the last wardens of the Scottish West March, who implemented the pogrom there as the Jews did in the East March. But Ulster does not recollect them. And equally, the border people have forgotten that they have many cousins in the north of Ireland. It is as if this host departed their homeland, immediately forgot it, and were immediately forgotten by it. I hope there's enough in this story to suggest a working hypothesis that the Scots Borders were the hard men of the plantation and provided the crucial leavening of an otherwise mediocre garrison throughout the settlement. More specifically, they held Enniskillen in the 1640s, and their sons and grandsons held it again during the Williamite War. It was born in Derry, Aughrim, Enniskillen, and the Boyne. If Enniskillen had fallen then, would Londonderry have held out? 1603 was a pivotal year in British and Irish history. There's even a book about it. 1603, the death of Queen Elizabeth I, the return of the Black Plague, the rise of Shakespeare, piracy, witchcraft, and the birth of the Stuart era. Needless to say, the book doesn't mention this story, but for us in Ireland, the great set of coincidences of 1603, end of the 9 Years' War, defeat of Gaelic Ulster, death of the English Queen, Scottish King gaining jurisdiction over all of Britain, pacification of the borders, plantation of Ulster, migration of the Scots Borders, has sent ripples all the way down the centuries to our own times. Probably. If I could just say, a version of this talk was published under this title in History Ireland in 1994, and it has now been included as an annex to the new publication of the Book of Ulster Surnames, which gives the histories of the 40 or so Scots border names, as well as 460 of the other most common names in 9 County Ulster. Thank you.